Welcome to Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. I'm your host, Kim Todd. On Digging Deeper, we have in-depth discussions with our extension experts about those important landscape topics. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the controversy surrounding glyphosate, commonly known by many people as Roundup. Thank you for joining us once again for Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. Although this seems like a negative subject, our discussion today about lethal dose, or LD50, and its relationship to the popular but controversial product Roundup is one we're going to have. And of course, the question is glyphosate or Roundup safe for use? Roch will help us start with a couple of definitions and maybe a little bit of a timeline.
Great. I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight, because I think it's important that people working in the garden and landscape professionals know about the hazards of anything they work with.
All right, so LD50, what does that mean exactly?
That sounds like catastrophic, lethal dose 50, and it's technically the term used for a testing that they do for what would kill 50% of a population if they ingested, or if they wiped it on their hands, or if they inhaled it. You know, they have dermal LD50s, they have ingestion LD50s, you know, they have inhalation LD50s. And they use surrogate animals, you know, often guinea pigs or rats or mice or any number of other things. And this is the first thing that they do when they're testing many products, is test for its toxicity. Now, toxicity can be acute, what would happen if you consumed a lot of it in a short amount of time, which would happen immediately, or it can be chronic. Chronic toxicity refers to things like birth defects and cancer and other things. And the current controversy surrounding Roundup really stems on the controversy or the concern about cancer and the herbicide glyphosate. Glyphosate was released in 1974 and called Roundup by Monsanto. It's been a long-going product. In the early days, it went through a barrage of tests to make sure that it was safe, both short-term and long-term, chronic and acute toxicities, and it was found to be safe and non-carcinogenic. But recently, things have come about that make us wonder whether that is indeed true, and is there validity in what people are saying or some organizations are saying.
All right, so I think maybe we have some interesting LD50, what is toxic and what isn't, that really would kind of surprise people a little bit.
Right.
Any of that you want to really expand on?
So water has an LD50. It's relatively safe, right? But when you look at the LD50, which would be the lethal dose to kill 50% of a population, once again, I hate using that term lethal, but it's true. And, you know, so for a human being, that would be a number that's relatively high, you know. But you think about water and you think about drowning, so for something to be toxic just means that it has a potential to cause harm. And of course, everything has a potential to cause harm, and the dose makes the poison. So water has a really high, it's classified as relatively non-toxic, and then we can go down the list and go to things that become more toxic. So the lower the number, the higher the toxicity, because the lower dose it takes to cause whatever the negative effect from inhalation, ingestion, or dermal absorption. So once again, water is relatively high. Glyphosate falls into the slightly toxic group, but along with that are common products that you use on a day-to-day basis. Things like salt and other things fall into those same categories. So the reality of it is that it is relatively non-toxic and not as, say, acutely toxic like something like, you know, nicotine in a cigarette. So there's the scale. It's on the lower end of that scale, which makes you fairly confident that from a short-term health standpoint, it's safe to use.
All right, and the one that fascinates me, of course, is caffeine, which, especially since so many of us are working from home, I'm not entirely sure how we're surviving without that caffeine.
Well, and I think we're not. And of course, we are consuming coffee. And as a matter of fact, later when we talk about chronic toxicities, hot beverages, tea, coffee, or whatever, actually categorized as being about the same toxicity or the same potential, for cancer as glyphosate. So intriguing when you look at those numbers and do comparative analysis, how one sounds like it's horrible, and yet you look at the things that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. And not everyone drinks coffee or hot tea, but it still has some chronic toxicity related to it.
And I think one of the things that confuses people as they start to understand this is the lower the number, the greater the toxicity.
Exactly, and so it's like the difference between a teaspoon of product causing a major harm and a teaspoon of another product causing no harm. The lower the LD50, the greater the toxicity. It's kind of like golf. The lower the score, the better you did, except this is kind of a bad thing.
A little bit worse, yeah.
A little bit worse, because we're talking lethal dose.
Yeah. Okay, Roch. Well, the World Health Organization has, of course, been in the news a great deal lately, as we would expect. And it has another agency that really focuses on identifying the causes of cancer, and that is the IARC.
Right.
Can you describe their classification system and what that is? What
Sure.
is that?
And the International Agency for Research on Cancer is one of the World Health Organization components. There's 4 components in WHO, or the World Health Organization, and this is the one that does research on cancer hazards. But it's hazards, not risk, and there's a difference between a hazard. So if anything has even a minuscule amount of potential, then it receives a category. And essentially they have 4 categories, and they put glyphosate in the probable cancer-causing group. And when you look at that, you say, well, that's, if it probably may cause cancer, then we certainly are going to be concerned about that. But in that same group is red meat and other things that, once again, we consume at a relatively, for people that are non-vegetarian, at a relatively high rate. So you have to look at those categories. And it's also just the potential. It has nothing to do with dose. It has nothing to do with the other things that are associated with the normal acute toxicity number of an LD50. So it's difficult to put a definitive number on what it takes. But some of the work that has been done outside IARC has basically showed that with the potential for residue on something like a breakfast cereal, you would literally have to consume a breakfast cereal for 9 hours a day and have some absurd amount of dose to even come close to the minuscule amount related to what could be potentially harmful with the product glyphosate. So the potential for consuming that much for either acute or chronic toxicity is extremely low, if non-existent.
And wasn't one of the issues also associated with IARC that out of the 4 different agencies in WHO, they were kind of the outlier in this whole conversation?
That's a great point, Kim, and that's exactly right. When you look at IARC and their classification scheme, and then you look at there's another branch of the World Health Organization that deals with chemistries, right? And the chemists look at things very scientifically, very rigorously, and they don't consider it a carcinogen. The other 2 agencies exclusive of IARC within the World Health Organization also don't consider it a carcinogen. So 3 out of the 4. So you have these, much like the federal government, you have these different branches, and they don't always agree. But when 3 out of 4 from the World Health Organization, which is the international body that's non-regulatory, but nonetheless carries some weight in the world, and 3 out of 4 of them say it's not carcinogenic, then you have to question some of the methodology that they used for the IARC determination that it is that it could cause cancer. And indeed, many people have. And there's a study that was done recently that tracked the use of glyphosate by farmers and their families for a 20-year period, and they saw no relationship between the use of glyphosate and specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is the cancer that IARC said is most problematic with Roundup, right? So, or with glyphosate. So you throw that into the equation, and there's overwhelming evidence that it is not a carcinogen. And like many products, you want to use them safely and judiciously, but you certainly don't want to get steered away from using a product that has been proven to be effective for an extremely long time.
So you referenced that study, which I think was the National Cancer Institute.
Yes.
And a 20-year study released in 2018. Go into a little bit more detail about that, and then talk about where EPA sort of sits in this entire conversation.
Well, let's start with the EPA, and then we'll go to the Cancer Institute study, which gives it credibility. But when you consider the EPA doesn't release a product till it goes through, as I mentioned earlier, an extensive array of tests for efficacy. How well does it work? Does it work? Can the label make the claims that it does? And then what are the health hazards associated with that, both short-term, acute, like the LD50, and long-term, like things like birth defects and mutagenicity and a barrage of other tests. And every product released, for use in the United States has to go through this barrage of tests. And that's why many products cost as much as they do. And even post-patent, you still have to rely on those standards to show that, yes, this product is safe to use. Glyphosate and its associated products has not been shown to have been involved in any sort of toxic acute sort of ingestion or any of the others that we described. And then this study with the cancer, now we'll go back to the Cancer Institute, clearly shows that tracking farm families who are the most probable to come in contact with Roundup or glyphosate on a daily basis, right? Because they're using Roundup-ready crops or glyphosate-tolerant crops on almost the percentage of acreages of corn and soybeans. So we're talking about a lot of people that they assessed. I believe it was, and I could be misquoting here, but I believe it was 500 families that they tracked, not only the farmer, whether it was a woman or a male, but also the children involved and any offspring and relatives that worked in the farming operation were all tracked. So 500 families equates to quite a few people. No relationship between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and cancer among that population. There was not a cause and effect relationship there. And then if you look at the data, you can collect this on Google if you are so inclined. You can get the increased use in Roundup over the last, since '74 when it's released, and especially after the release of the glyphosate tolerant crops, you can see this exponential increase in use. But then if you go to the American Cancer Society and look at incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma over that same period, that's a static line. There is no increase. So once again, if you thought that a product would be causing cancer, you would see some sort of cause and effect relationship, and yet you don't. You see an exponential increase in use and a static infection of cancer, non-Hodgkin's specifically, over that same time period. I think the data clearly indicates that the IARC incorrectly came forward with this classification, but based on their criteria, it made some sense to them, and yet it got exploited by some of the less scrupulous people out there.
And that's really what happened, isn't it? That all of a sudden it's sort of the first thing you read, or the sky is falling, and then people believe that or listen to that rather than really the deep science.
And that's where it happened. In 2015, one of the first glyphosate tort law, which is a very different kind of law. It's a civil case. It's not legal. I mean, it's not criminal. And they found in favor of multiple plaintiffs that glyphosate and their use of glyphosate in their jobs or in their home caused non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the rewards, or the awards, not the rewards, the awards were unbelievable, multiple $1 million, $30 million, $40 million, this kind of things, which seemed, it caught a lot of people's eyes. Now, tort law is a little different in that, and especially because of, majority of these cases are in Colorado, although there are other locations, in California. In California, they have some strange laws that almost anything has the potential to cause cancer, and at what level, and they have to label everything accordingly. So food labels and chemical labels in California are very different than they are anywhere else, and they used the IARC ruling, or the IARC finding, to determine that the laws in California clearly state that this could cause cancer based on this, very restricted criteria, and therefore these lawsuits came about primarily because a group of lawyers, got people to do this, and then once that started gaining momentum, you've seen the ads on TV. People are clearly stepping up to do this, and so the number of cases has increased exponentially as well, and yet there is still no scientifically valid information that shows that glyphosate is a cause of, or results in a higher incidence among users of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that's the entire thing the case was based on. Tort law is an interesting thing because scientific data was not allowed to be introduced into the proceedings. Wow. So without science behind it, then clearly they have people whose father died or grandfather died, and they tug on the heartstrings of the juries. The juries themselves, in some cases in California, are not 12, they're 6. And so a lawyer only has to convince 6 people. It's a very interesting thing. And it's not that tort law is flawed, because there's been many tort cases that have resulted in great things. Some of these, chemical things that have happened with spills and those kind of have resulted in injury and documentable and science-based injury to people. But that's not what occurred with glyphosate. It was a couple of little bookkeeping, trivial things that are not scientifically proven to be linked to a higher incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma among end users. Clearly, that's not true.
Well, and I think the other thing that's really interesting is now that the patent is off, you look at the array of products and the one, where is the glyphosate in the product, or is it not in some? And people get confused just by looking for the product and not knowing, of course, what they're using it for, which is one of the things we talk about all the time on Backyard. Read the label and know what you're talking about with it.
Well, if you walk into a garden store right now, you will probably see a minimum of 6 different products labeled as Roundup. Now, for the farmers and the larger scale users, Roundup is indeed primarily a glyphosate-containing product. But in the garden store, there's a product called Roundup Extend. It's glyphosate plus another chemical to make it last longer. And there's, label restrictions and everything else you need to be tolerant of. The majority of them do have some glyphosate in them, but there's one in particular called Roundup for Lawns that obviously has no glyphosate in it because it's a non-selective herbicide. And if you sprayed that over blanket treated your lawn, you would kill the majority of the lawn. So it's not, so it doesn't have glyphosate in it. And it's much like some of the other available products, like a 3-way product that has, a broadleaf herbicide in it and some other things. So Roundup for Lawns contains no glyphosate. So it's a trade name among consumers, especially in the consumer landscape market. It's a trade name as opposed to a Roundup primarily glyphosate-based product that would be used in commercial operations like corn, bean, cotton, and some of the other Roundup-ready crops, or just as a routine non-selective in and around the farmstead. Roundup may contain only glyphosate, or it may contain up to 3 or 4 other chemicals, depending upon the product. So make sure you read those labels when you walk into the store and are thinking about picking up, if it is indeed glyphosate you want. Make sure you get glyphosate. Don't get glyphosate plus, because this the Roundup Extend, for example, is designed to prolong activity on, say, cracks in your sidewalk or your patio. And if you put that in your landscape, it's entirely probable that nothing will grow there for a 6 to 12 month period. That's not the result you want. So clearly you need to read the labels. And they use the same sort of tag for Roundup. And so it's easy to make that mistake. But look and make sure that you look at the label every time you walk in the store. You should be doing this for anything you purchase.
So based on that comment, which of course we make, and I appreciate your making it again, and all the information you just provided, what are we going to leave our audience with in this discussion?
I think we want to be clear that glyphosate has been widely tested, both as a formulated product called Roundup and as other products as well. And it is not proven to be acutely toxic. It's safe to use. You certainly don't want to ingest it, but if you did, it would take such a large amount of material, it would be nearly impossible to get that kind of level into your system. But it is a pesticide, so keep it out of the way of children. Make sure you follow mixing and label directions with any pesticide, and I don't care if you think you're a consumer and you don't have to follow the rules. It's not legal that you have to wear, but I would wear gloves regardless of what product you're using, and follow those label directions succinctly and clearly, and make sure you do what they say. Mix it according to directions. There's a lot of things you need to do, and it's pretty clear in the directions how to do that. Read the label. I don't know how many times I see people at home go, and the label gets tossed.
Right.
And that just drives me bonkers, because that label has information in it that you need for that product to be effective. And ultimately you've made the economic decision to buy it. Let's make sure it works so you're not wasting your money. So be safe when you use these products. Glyphosate does not have any scientific data to say that it's acutely toxic or chronically toxic for something like cancer, including non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So don't buy into the ads on TV that this is an opportunity to make a lot of money, because ultimately, my opinion is that most of those lawsuits will be thrown out.
And the final note on reading that label and mixing as the directions say, more is not better.
Yeah, there's a rate for a reason, and
Right.
more doesn't work better. Thanks, Kim. I forgot that in that little rant that I went on, but clearly more is not better. They're designed to work at the rates that they were tested on. And you save money if you put it on at the rates that they suggest, rather than 3 cups, 3 cups rather than 1. But perfect way to end it.
All right, excellent. Well, that is all the time we have for Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. And we want to say thanks to Roch for coming by to help us with this very important and very interesting, unusual, controversial topic. We'll be back next week with another discussion about gardening topics that matter to you. Be sure to watch Backyard Farmer live every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central on NET. Thanks for digging deeper with Backyard Farmer.